Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling stories ever documented in the annals of Colorado's past. Before we begin, take a moment to comment below where you're tuning in from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're always curious to see how far and wide these historical accounts travel and at what hours they find their listeners. In the bitter winter of 1869, the small mining town of Black Hawk, Colorado, then part of Gilpin County, witnessed the opening of a modest yet curious new boarding house on its northern outskirts. Rising 3 stories high with fading white paint, the structure stood on a small incline, offering a commanding view of the town's main road and the distant mines that sustained its economy. The property had recently been purchased by 2 sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth Wakefield, who had journeyed west from Pennsylvania after the death of their parents. According to county purchase documents dated December 3, 1869, the sisters paid in full an uncommon act in a boomtown where fortunes shifted daily among prospectors and miners. The building soon became known simply as the Wakefield Boardinghouse, quickly earning a local reputation for its cleanliness and strict order qualities seldom found in mining settlements of the time. Margaret, the elder at 32, managed the financial and public aspects of their business, while her younger sister, Elizabeth, then 25, handled the cooking and household maintenance. Though reserved and somewhat reclusive, the sisters were generally regarded as decent and industrious women by the townspeople. Within half a year, their boarding house had taken in 12 permanent lodgers, all of them men employed at nearby mines, and occasionally welcomed travelers passing through on business. Yet, what truly made the Wakefield sisters stand out was not simply their role as independent women in the rugged frontier, but the unusual restrictions they enforced upon their tenants. As noted in the diary of Mary Hollister, the apothecary's wife and a reliable chronicler of local gossip, the Wakefields imposed a series of strict household rules. Silence was to be observed during set hours, alcohol was strictly forbidden, and attendance at Sunday services in the newly built Methodist church was mandatory. Most curiously, women were not allowed to visit the men's rooms under any circumstances, a policy that, according to later reports, became even more rigid over time. Records from the Colorado Historical Society reveal that both sisters were consistent attendees at Sunday worship, though they rarely participated in other church gatherings. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore's own notes describe Margaret as a serious woman with a deep, almost obsessive fascination with scriptural passages concerning purification and moral cleansing. Elizabeth, on the other hand, spoke little and was often seen observing others with an unsettling intensity, as though measuring every soul in the congregation. By the late 1860 seconds, Black Hawk had grown beyond its early days as a rough cluster of tents from the Pikes Peak gold rush of 1859. By 1869, it had developed into a thriving settlement of roughly 500 residents. Along its main street stood a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, a blacksmith's workshop, the apothecary, and a mining company office that oversaw ore processing operations on the town's western edge. Life, however, remained perilous. Death was common from mine collapses, disease, or drunken disputes. Women made up less than 1/5 of the population, most being wives of tradesmen or miners rather than entrepreneurs. This made the Wakefield sisters' enterprise particularly rare, and perhaps explains why their peculiar habits drew little public criticism. The winter of 1869 into 1870 passed peacefully at the boarding house. Those who later survived would describe the sisters' daily routines as nearly ceremonial in their precision. Breakfast was always served at exactly 5:30 a.m., allowing the miners to reach their shifts by sunrise. Dinner was presented at 7 p.m., after the men had bathed in basins of warm water prepared by Elizabeth. Every Friday evening, Margaret would collect rent payments, carefully documenting each transaction in a small, leather-bound ledger. A letter written by one of their first boarders, Michael Donovan, to his sister in Boston, now preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, and cited in a 1965 doctoral study on frontier migration, offers a glimpse into life within the Wakefield establishment. This house surpasses my expectations. Though far different from our home in Dorchester, it possesses a level of order and cleanliness that would impress even Mother. My quarters, though small, contain a sturdy bed, a writing desk, and a mountain view that makes the hardships of this life bearable. The elder sister, Miss Wakefield, conducts all affairs with the precision of a military officer, while her younger sibling watches each of us with eyes that seem to miss nothing. The meals are plain but nourishing, and the absence of drink creates a peace uncommon in this part of the world. I sleep more soundly here than I have since leaving home, though I must admit, the altitude brings with it peculiar dreams. The letter, like the town's whispers, paints a picture of a house governed by discipline and silence, an island of order in a land ruled by chaos. But as history would later reveal, that silence may have concealed far darker truths. Donovan's letter stands as the only first-hand testimony describing life at the Wakefield boarding house before the mysterious vanishings began. He left Black Hawk in March of 1870, having found better prospects with a surveying expedition heading north. Later correspondence confirms he departed willingly and carried fond recollections of his time there, a sharp contrast to the fate of those who remained behind. The first disappearance occurred in April of 1870. Samuel Thatcher, a 26-year-old miner from Ohio who had been living at the Wakefield establishment since January, failed to appear for his morning shift. His absence was immediately noted by his supervisor, who dispatched a messenger to the boarding house to inquire about him. Margaret Wakefield reportedly showed little alarm, explaining that Thatcher had paid his dues the night before and mentioned plans to move west in search of new opportunities. No official report was ever filed. The incident might have slipped entirely from memory had it not been for the unsettling pattern that soon followed. Tax documents reveal that Thatcher had been employed by the Black Hawk Mining Company for roughly 9 months prior to vanishing. His partially recovered personnel file salvaged after the devastating fire of 1,872 describes him as dependable yet withdrawn, with no known relatives in the territory. A photograph accompanying his employment papers shows a slender young man with hollow eyes and a somber face, one of the countless nameless workers who drifted through the western frontier in pursuit of fortune. Between April and November of that same year, 3 more residents of the boarding house disappeared without notice. Each time, Margaret Wakefield offered the same explanation. The men had paid what they owed and departed to seek work elsewhere. In a transient mining town where people often abandon jobs overnight in pursuit of the next strike, such absences aroused little suspicion. The Wakefield establishment maintained its spotless reputation, and new tenants soon filled the vacant rooms. Only in hindsight would investigators recognize the pattern. The second man to vanish was Frederick Miller, a German immigrant who had labored in the mines for over a year. According to company logs, Miller was a skilled timberman tasked with reinforcing tunnel beams, a respected and well-paid position. When he disappeared in June 1870, Margaret claimed he had left to join a cousin's brewing business in Denver. Later investigations revealed that no such enterprise ever existed. 2 months later, in August, another boarder named James Wilson reportedly departed for California after hearing tales of fertile land and opportunity in the Sacramento Valley. Unlike the others, Wilson had openly expressed dissatisfaction with mining and often spoke of returning to farm work, so his supposed departure seemed believable. The 4th disappearance occurred in early November. Thomas Brooks, listed in Margaret's ledger as a boarder from Kentucky, was said to have received a letter calling him home for family matters. The explanation was accepted without question. Yet, none of these men ever collected their final wages from the Black Hawk Mining Company, a fact that went unnoticed until a payroll clerk, while reconciling quarterly records, discovered several unclaimed accounts. By then, the disappearances had already formed a quiet, ominous pattern that no one had yet pieced together. Another clue, long overlooked, appeared in the writings of Dr. William Foster, the town's physician. In his private journal, Foster noted that each of the missing men had exhibited similar symptoms in the weeks preceding their disappearance. He had treated Frederick Miller for what he described as nervous exhaustion 2 weeks before the man vanished, observing an unnatural pallor and weakness, which he attributed to poor air quality in the mines. Wilson, too, had consulted him in July, complaining of fatigue and dizziness. Only later would these shared symptoms be recognized as potential signs of poisoning or deliberate illness, though by then, the truth was buried under months of snow and silence. The winter of 1871 was particularly brutal across the Colorado highlands. Snowdrifts cut off the mining towns for weeks at a time, isolating entire communities. During this long freeze, the Wakefield boardinghouse took on an eerie stillness. Witnesses recalled that smoke poured continuously from its 3 chimneys, yet the windows remained dark most nights. The sisters were rarely seen in town, sending a young errand boy to fetch supplies once a week. When townsfolk inquired about the well-being of their boarders, Margaret and Elizabeth assured them that everyone was safe and simply keeping indoors during the severe weather. This same period would later be identified as the most active phase of the sisters' hidden operations. Elizabeth's personal journal, discovered years later, contained a chilling series of entries dated between December 1870 and February 1871, describing in disturbingly clinical detail the treatment of 5 men. However, only 3 disappearances were ever officially reported the following spring. Historians and investigators have since concluded that some victims may have been transient laborers whose absence went unnoticed, or that the sisters had by then perfected methods of disposing of bodies while preserving the illusion of a fully occupied house. That winter's snowfall reached depths exceeding 6 feet in some areas, sealing Black Hawk in a white silence and concealing the horrors quietly unfolding behind the Wakefield sisters' shuttered windows. The relentless snowstorm sealed the community off from the outside world for nearly 6 weeks. As roads and mountain passes vanished beneath towering drifts, food reserves dwindled, forcing many residents to survive on canned goods, salted meats, and whatever small game could be trapped or hunted in the frozen woods. Mining operations came to a complete halt by mid-January, as the transport of ore to the smelting facilities became impossible. Yet, curiously, the Wakefield sisters appeared unaffected by the scarcity. According to the general store's ledgers, they continued to purchase unusually large amounts of food throughout the worst of the winter, quantities that, in hindsight, were far beyond what would be necessary for their recorded number of tenants. This discrepancy, though overlooked at the time, would later take on grim significance. Among Elizabeth Wakefield's surviving journal entries, one dated January 17, 1871, is particularly disturbing. The prolonged isolation affords ideal circumstances for extended observation. Subject C has remained in a sedated state for 12 days with minimal nourishment. The progressive effects of bloodletting are most revealing. I have adjusted the compound to include mineral agents which hasten the division of moral corruption from the physical vessel. When the spring thaw finally arrived, witnesses noted that the number of residents at the boarding house appeared to have decreased, though no one could determine by how many. The sisters themselves grew increasingly reclusive, keeping their curtains drawn even during daylight hours and declining all social invitations. The boarders, once seen walking in groups to the mines, were now rarely observed at all. Those few who were spotted appeared gaunt and withdrawn, avoiding conversation and moving quickly about their business with lowered gazes. On April 3, 1871, an advertisement appeared in the Central City Register, the nearest newspaper, announcing available rooms at the Wakefield boarding house, the first such notice since its founding. The language of the advertisement emphasized moral accommodations for respectable single gentlemen and a wholesome environment conducive to bodily and spiritual improvement. Historians later interpreted this as evidence that the sisters had depleted their initial group of victims and were now seeking replacements. In June of that year, Dr. William Foster, the town's sole physician, was summoned to the Wakefield residence to attend to a miner suffering from a hand injury. His medical records, still preserved in the Colorado Historical Society archives, describe the scene in unsettling detail. He found the boarding house spotless, almost unnaturally so, yet steeped in an oppressive quiet. Though it was midday, the interior remained dim, the windows covered with heavy drapes that blocked out nearly all sunlight. The patient, listed as James Cooper, displayed a crushed hand consistent with an industrial accident, but the wound was several days old and showing clear signs of infection, suggesting a troubling delay in seeking treatment. What most disturbed the doctor, however, was the nature of Cooper's room bare to the point of sterility. There were no personal effects, no clothing other than what he wore, and no photographs or keepsakes that might hint at his life before Black Hawk. Even the bed linens appeared freshly changed, crisp and white. When Foster gently inquired about Cooper's family back east, the injured man grew visibly distressed. Before he could continue the conversation, Margaret Wakefield intervened, abruptly dismissing the question. The doctor urged that Cooper be moved to his clinic for proper care, but Margaret refused, insisting that her sister Elizabeth was fully capable of handling his treatment and would follow his written instructions precisely. Unable to compel compliance, Foster left the house uneasy. 3 days later, Margaret notified the mining company that James Cooper had succumbed to his wounds. No post-mortem examination was conducted, and the body was laid to rest in the small hillside cemetery overlooking the town. Records from a 1,905 grave survey confirmed the existence of his headstone, a simple marker, reading only his name and the year, 1871. What Dr. Foster could not have known was that Cooper's death marked a significant change in the sisters' methods. Elizabeth's private notes reveal that his injury had presented an opportunity for experimentation. The damaged limb offers ideal conditions for a more assertive intervention. Under ordinary treatment, amputation would be inevitable, but our techniques may yet prove superior. M expresses unease at the doctor's inquiries, yet has permitted continuation of the process. A follow-up entry, written 3 days later, concludes bleakly. The subject proved too frail for the procedure. Contamination spread faster than anticipated, resulting in premature termination. Adjustments must be made. M has arranged for conventional disposal, risky, but necessary to maintain standing within the community. Future selections must consider physical endurance. By the autumn of 1871, murmurs about the Wakefield sisters began circulating through Black Hawk. Schoolteacher Sarah Peaton, in a letter to her cousin, recorded the emerging rumors. The sisters, she wrote, were said to inspect the boarders' rooms daily while the men were away at work, confiscating any personal items they deemed improper. What had once been whispered as eccentricity was slowly curdling into fear, and the true nature of the Wakefield household was only beginning to surface. One miner later claimed to have witnessed Elizabeth Wakefield burning stacks of paper behind the house shortly after conducting one of her room inspections. Another reported hearing distinct movement in the attic during the late-night hours, though the sisters firmly insisted that the upper floor was used only for storage and remained locked at all times. Church records from the Methodist congregation indicate that around this same period, Margaret Wakefield's attendance at Sunday services became sporadic, while Elizabeth stopped attending entirely. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore, in the margins of his parish register, noted growing concern over Margaret's increasingly unconventional remarks about sin. In one unsettling exchange, she allegedly described certain people as vessels of corruption who required purification beyond spiritual remedy. Mining company payroll records from September through November of 1871 reveal a troubling discrepancy. Of the 12 men listed as residents of the Wakefield boarding house, only 7 appeared regularly to collect their pay. When questioned, these men explained that they were delivering the wages to housemates who were confined due to illness or other personal matters. The clerk, finding no technical irregularity, documented the anomaly but did not pursue the issue further. In December 1871, a mining engineer named Thomas Grayson arrived from Denver to survey several claims in the surrounding hills. Unaware of the local rumors, he arranged a 2-week stay at the Wakefield boarding house. His detailed personal journal, rediscovered in 1962 during a university archival project, would later provide one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the sisters' final months in operation. Grayson, then 39, was a graduate of Yale's Sheffield Scientific School and a seasoned engineer with extensive experience across the western mining territories. He had been dispatched by a Denver investment group to evaluate the profitability of new ore veins in the Black Hawk region. From the moment of his arrival, Grayson observed the sisters with an analytical eye. He described Margaret Wakefield as a woman of rigid discipline, whose attempts at civility seemed rehearsed, her politeness never reaching her eyes. Elizabeth, he found far more disquieting, a figure who drifts through the corridors like a shadow, speaking rarely and in tones so faint one had to lean close to hear. The other boarders, mostly miners and labourers, maintained what Grayson termed a conspiracy of silence. They spoke only about essential matters at meals and dispersed immediately afterward, avoiding unnecessary conversation. As an educated outsider and professional visitor, Grayson fell outside the sisters' usual sphere of control, a fact that may well have preserved his life and allowed his testimony to survive. His initial observations of the house echoed Dr. William Foster's earlier impressions. He described the residence as a place of contradictions, meticulous in its cleanliness, yet devoid of warmth, as though the rooms were arranged for display rather than habitation. The parlour and dining hall were immaculately ordered, but the perfection felt unnatural, almost theatrical. A faint medicinal odour lingered beneath the expected sense of coal smoke and cooking. Most striking to him was the absence of natural light. Thick draperies shrouded every window, and lamps burned at their lowest setting even during daylight hours. On his third night in residence, Grayson was startled awake by what he recorded as a slow, dragging sound, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor above. The noise was followed by creaking footsteps descending the back staircase and the soft thud of the rear door opening and closing. Drawn by curiosity, he moved to the window and, in the dim glow of moonlight, saw Elizabeth Wakefield crossing the yard toward a small outbuilding while carrying a lantern. She remained inside for roughly 20 minutes before returning to the house. Grayson noted that she appeared to be wearing a different dress upon her return, though the darkness made it difficult to be certain. The next morning, Margaret Wakefield informed the tenants that one of their number, a miner named Erickson, had departed unexpectedly during the night after receiving word of a family emergency. When Grayson mentioned that he had heard movement, Margaret fixed him with what he described as a gaze so penetrating that I could not hold it. She calmly explained that Elizabeth suffered from bouts of insomnia and often busied herself with domestic chores during sleepless hours. The topic was dropped. Still, Grayson's unease deepened. He wrote that the explanation seemed improbable. No messenger or rider had arrived in town that night to deliver news, and in the thin mountain air, even distant hoofbeats carried clearly, yet he had heard none. Moreover, he recalled speaking with Erickson the evening before, during which the man expressed plans to accompany him on a survey of the eastern claim the following morning. Erickson had shown great interest in Grayson's theodolite, an instrument he had never before seen in use. He gave no sign of distress or urgency, Grayson wrote, and certainly none of impending departure. Over the days that followed, Grayson noted that the household's routines were executed with mechanical precision. Meals were served at the exact same hour each day, portions identical down to the ounce. The food, while sufficient, was bland and repetitive, consisting mainly of boiled meats and root vegetables. Conversation during these meals was minimal, and laughter was entirely absent. The longer Grayson stayed, the more he sensed that the perfection of the Wakefield house concealed something methodical and monstrous beneath its surface. Conversation at the boarding house was always subdued and closely controlled. Whenever talk drifted toward personal matters or life beyond the confines of the house, Margaret Wakefield would clear her throat softly, a subtle signal that brought an immediate end to the discussion. What disturbed Thomas Grayson most, however, was the demeanor of the other residents. He described them as men who had surrendered their individuality to routine, their actions governed entirely by habit and an unspoken fear of disruption. His engineer's mind inclined him to notice details others might have missed. For instance, he recorded that the household's water usage far exceeded what could be reasonably accounted for by its number of occupants or daily activities. The sisters kept a large copper boiler running almost continuously, consuming quantities of water that suggested either obsessive cleanliness or some undisclosed purpose. Likewise, the rate at which they purchased certain materials, particularly salt, alcohol, and powders from the local apothecary, appeared excessive for an ordinary establishment of its size. On the 7th night of his stay, Grayson was jolted awake by a disturbance from the adjoining room. A series of dull thuds, followed by what he took to be a muffled cry. He pressed his ear to the wall and heard the faint sounds of a brief struggle, then silence. Alarmed, he stepped into the hallway just as Elizabeth Wakefield emerged from the neighboring chamber. According to his account, she carried a small basin veiled with a cloth. Upon noticing him, she paused, not startled, but regarding him with an emotionless, calculating stare. She inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging his presence, before gliding down the hallway toward the back stairs. Grayson stood frozen, seized by an inexplicable dread that robbed him of both voice and movement. The following morning, the occupant of the neighboring room was absent from breakfast. Margaret informed the boarders that the man had been called away suddenly to aid a cousin in Denver. When Grayson asked when he had departed, she replied, "Very early, before first light." He was most apologetic for any disturbance. No one at the table questioned her explanation. The men simply nodded, eyes lowered to their plates. Grayson's journal from that day reveals a growing moral and psychological conflict. "I find myself in the intolerable position of suspecting grave wrongdoing," he wrote, "yet possessing no proof sufficient to justify interference. The sisters' behavior, while strange beyond measure, falls short of open criminality. Their reputation for piety would shield them from suspicion in any court of local opinion. Yet I cannot shake the conviction that something profoundly unwholesome transpires within these walls, something that explains the hollow compliance of the remaining men." He resolved to finish his work as swiftly as possible. Though he had paid for a full 2 weeks' lodging, Grayson left after only 10 days, citing urgent business. In his final entry regarding the house, he confessed, "I cannot define the evil that dwells there, but I am certain it exists. The Wakefield sisters maintain a facade of virtue that conceals a corruption I dare not name. The men who remain seem somehow depleted, drained of vigor, their eyes dull and lifeless. I have taken to propping a chair beneath my doorknob each night, and I wake at every sound. Tomorrow I shall remove to the hotel in Central City, inferior as its comforts may be." Upon returning to Denver, Grayson wrestled with whether to alert authorities. Ultimately, he refrained. His observations, though deeply troubling, amounted to conjecture. Instead, he meticulously recorded every detail in his field journal and confided his misgivings to a colleague within the mining consortium, someone who, as his later letter to his brother in Connecticut suggests, had business connections in Gilpin County. That private conversation may have quietly sown the first seeds of suspicion among investors and townsmen alike. The winter of 1871–1872 brought relative stability to Black Hawk. Unlike the previous year's isolation, mining operations continued steadily, and the settlement maintained contact with neighboring camps. Outwardly, the Wakefield Boardinghouse functioned as usual, though townspeople later remarked that the sisters were seen even less frequently than before. Elizabeth, in particular, seemed to vanish entirely from public view. Church attendance records confirmed that Margaret Wakefield ceased participating in services after Christmas of 1871. When Reverend Whitmore called at the house to express concern for her spiritual well-being, he was received courteously in the parlor, but denied entry beyond it. In his parish notes, he described her as altered in countenance, her severity now tinged with a feverish intensity. Most unsettling, Margaret explained her absence as necessary, citing Elizabeth's declining health and the need for constant care. The Reverend offered prayers for her sister's recovery, but noted that Margaret accepted them with a visible impatience, as though the intrusion had disturbed some pressing, private duty. Then, in March of 1872, an event occurred that would later prove crucial to understanding what had been happening behind the Wakefield walls. A fire broke out in the offices of the local mining company, destroying a number of payroll and employment ledgers. During the efforts to rescue surviving documents, a clerk named Harold Williams was overheard making a curious remark about anomalies he had previously noticed in the company's accounts, an observation that would soon cast new and troubling light on the Wakefield sisters' establishment. It seemed too great a coincidence that so many men from the Wakefield Boardinghouse had disappeared without ever collecting their wages. This casual remark by the mining clerk caught the ear of Sheriff Robert Buchanan, who had recently assumed office following the sudden death of his predecessor. Buchanan was not an ordinary frontier lawman. He was a former Pinkerton detective, a man trained to recognize inconsistencies and patterns that others might overlook. His disciplined, analytical approach would soon uncover one of the most disturbing sequences of disappearances in the region's history. Intrigued, Buchanan began a discreet investigation. He cross-referenced employment and payroll records from the mining company with the official Boardinghouse registry, which the Wakefield sisters were legally required to maintain for tax purposes. What he discovered, later preserved in a report unearthed from the Gilpin County Archives in 1964, revealed a chilling pattern. Over the course of 27 months, 17 men listed as residents of the Wakefield boarding house had vanished without notice. None had collected their final wages, nor were they ever seen in nearby towns or mining camps again. Buchanan's investigative instincts, sharpened during his years with the Pinkerton Agency in Chicago and St. Louis, made him skeptical of coincidences. His handwritten field notes, kept alongside his official report, show his growing unease. The pattern defies chance. These men vanish, leaving wages, unclaimed behavior, inconsistent with working men, accustomed to earning every dollar. The Wakefield sisters provide explanations too uniform, too rehearsed. It is as though they speak from a script. There is something amiss in that house. On the 7th of April, 1872, Sheriff Buchanan paid a formal visit to the Wakefield boarding house. Margaret Wakefield received him in the parlor, a room he described as immaculately arranged yet strangely lifeless, as though maintained for inspection rather than comfort. When confronted with the inconsistencies in her records, Margaret responded calmly and with disarming precision. She claimed that some tenants had left for the Nevada silver fields, while others had returned east to seek employment closer to family. None, she said, had left forwarding addresses. Unsurprising, she argued, given the transient nature of mining life. Throughout the exchange, Margaret's composure never wavered. She occasionally referred to a small notebook she carried, offering detailed, plausible accounts of each man's departure, complete with destinations, motives, and fragments of remembered conversations. Her poise faltered only once, when Buchanan raised the issue of unclaimed wages. She hesitated briefly before suggesting that the men may have forgotten to collect their pay in haste, or that arrangements for forwarding their earnings had simply not been followed through. When Buchanan requested permission to inspect the premises and speak with the current boarders, Margaret consented to the latter, but politely refused the former. She cited her sister's delicate health and the need to respect the tenants' privacy. Nevertheless, she extended a cordial invitation for the sheriff to return on Sunday evening, when all the boarders would be present for dinner. Over the following days, Buchanan conducted independent inquiries. He visited the local stagecoach depot, livery stable, and several freight operators who ran regular routes between Black Hawk and neighboring mining towns. None recalled transporting any of the missing men, though such records were rarely formalized. He also sent letters to contacts in Virginia City, Nevada, and Denver, requesting information about the supposed relocations. The responses when they came yielded nothing, yet demonstrated Buchanan's trademark thoroughness. True to his word, Buchanan returned that Sunday. He was introduced to the 12 men currently residing in the house. In his report, he described them as appearing healthy yet strangely subdued, speaking only when addressed. When questioned individually about their former housemates, their responses were vague and nearly identical. They remembered the missing men, but knew nothing of their destinations or reasons for leaving. None voiced any complaint about the Wakefield sisters or the conditions of the house. The uniformity of their replies struck Buchanan as deeply unnatural, yet without direct evidence, he could not proceed further. What particularly disturbed him was the pale and listless appearance of the men. His notes reflect his unease. All appear wan and fatigued, claiming their condition arises from the hardships of mining work. Yet I have known many miners, and though their labor wears on the body, it leaves them bronzed, vigorous, and hearty of appetite. These men seem frail, almost bloodless. Several bore small bandages on their arms or necks, which Miss Wakefield attributed to minor injuries sustained on the job. Dinner itself was modest, but well-prepared roast, beef, potatoes, bread, and apple pie. The meal passed in uneasy silence. Buchanan observed that Elizabeth Wakefield never joined them at the table. She remained in the kitchen, emerging only to deliver dishes or clear plates. Her appearance, as the sheriff noted, matched Reverend Whitmore's earlier account. She moved with visible weakness, her complexion wan, her demeanor withdrawn. She kept her eyes lowered, responding to Margaret's quiet directions without a word. To Buchanan, this frail, subdued woman seemed utterly inconsistent with the eerie, commanding presence described by Thomas Grayson in his journal, a contradiction that deepened the mystery surrounding the Wakefield sisters and the grim secret their immaculate boarding house seemed determined to conceal, encountering in the hallway at night. As Buchanan prepared to leave, he asked for permission to use the outhouse. Directed toward the rear of the property, he seized the opportunity to quietly survey the grounds. Behind the main house stood a small outbuilding, which he watched as Elizabeth Wakefield entered, a lantern faintly glowing in her hand. Beyond it stretched a neatly kept vegetable garden, surprisingly well tended for the early spring season. But one detail immediately drew his attention, an area of freshly disturbed earth, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, near the edge of the garden. In his official report, Buchanan later wrote, "The soil appears recently turned, though no signs of planting are visible." When questioned about the patch of earth, Miss Margaret explained that they were preparing a new bed for root vegetables, delayed due to the lingering frost. Though her answer was calm and plausible, the sheriff's instincts warned him otherwise. Combined with the other irregularities he had uncovered, this new discovery solidified his belief that something was terribly wrong. In his private notebook, Buchanan recorded his suspicions in stark language. The evidence is circumstantial, yet unmistakable to the discerning eye. Men enter that house and do not emerge again, whatever story is told. I am convinced I have found the final resting place of at least one such soul. Tomorrow I shall return with full authority to examine the property, including that disturbed ground. The next morning, armed with a warrant, Sheriff Buchanan returned to the Wakefield boarding house, only to find it consumed by flames. The fire, which had reportedly ignited in the kitchen, had spread rapidly through the dry timber structure. Despite the efforts of the volunteer fire brigade, the house was reduced to ashes within hours. Margaret Wakefield perished in the blaze. Her remains were recovered from the parlor, where she appeared to have succumbed to smoke inhalation while attempting to save personal belongings. Eyewitness accounts published in the Central City Register on April 12, 1872, described a chaotic and harrowing scene. The alarm was first raised shortly after dawn by a milk delivery boy, who noticed thick smoke pouring from the kitchen windows. By the time townspeople and firefighters arrived, flames had engulfed the rear of the house and were rapidly advancing toward the front. Most of the boarders had already departed for their morning shifts, returning only to find their home and nearly all their possessions destroyed. Elizabeth Wakefield, however, was nowhere to be found. Initial speculation held that she, too, had perished in the blaze, but a careful search of the ruins yielded only one body. There was no trace of Elizabeth's remains. When questioned, the surviving boarders, all of whom had been at work when the fire began, could offer no insight into her whereabouts or the cause of the blaze. A brief investigation concluded that the fire was accidental, likely the result of a kitchen mishap. Sheriff Buchanan, however, was far from convinced. In a letter dated April 20th, 1872, addressed to his former Pinkerton supervisor, he wrote, "The timing of this fire is far too convenient. That it should occur precisely when investigation became unavoidable strains belief. Though I cannot yet prove it, I am persuaded that the surviving sister set the blaze herself, both to destroy evidence and to facilitate her escape. Whether her sibling's death was intended or merely collateral, I cannot yet determine. Nor can I say whether the men remaining in the house were meant to perish as well." In the aftermath, attention turned to the outbuilding that had miraculously survived the inferno. The structure, presumed to be a laundry shed, contained the expected implements: washing tubs, a large copper boiler, irons, and mending tools. Yet as Buchanan surveyed the interior, something felt amiss. His sharp eye for spatial detail noted that the internal dimensions of the room did not match the building's exterior measurements. Trusting his instincts, Buchanan remeasured the structure and discovered a discrepancy of nearly 5 feet along the northern wall. Suspecting a hidden compartment, he ordered a closer inspection. By tapping along the wall's surface, he identified a hollow echo that betrayed the presence of a false partition. The planks, painted to match the surrounding wood, were soon pried loose, revealing a concealed chamber behind them. Inside, the sheriff found a narrow cot, a trunk of women's clothing, and a leather-bound journal belonging to Elizabeth Wakefield. The secret room appeared to have served as her private quarters, suggesting she often lived apart from her sister and the main household. The journal, now preserved in the Colorado State Archives, provides a deeply unsettling glimpse into the sisters' delusions. Written in Elizabeth's meticulous, controlled handwriting, it chronicles what she called the cleansing of the Boardinghouse residents. She described a systematic process of purification beginning with restricted diets and isolation, and escalating to nighttime procedures meant to purge moral corruption from the body. Elizabeth wrote openly of administering sedatives in evening meals, performing secret operations while her subjects slept, and disposing of those she deemed beyond redemption. The journal's opening pages reveal how she viewed herself not as a killer, but as a medical reformer, continuing the sacred work of her late father. Father's research, though halted by his untimely death, she wrote, laid the groundwork for our own. His discoveries concerning the link between moral decay and the composition of the blood were nothing short of revolutionary, though tragically misunderstood by his peers. We have merely refined his methods to achieve what he only glimpsed in theory. Margaret and I, Elizabeth had written, have been entrusted with Father's legacy, the purification of mankind through deliberate, selective intervention. I.U. Weber. The pages that followed traced a chilling progression in both method and conviction. At first, Elizabeth's efforts appeared almost clinical. She began with dietary experiments, carefully recording how different restrictions affected her boarders' behavior and appearance. She observed that removing red meat from their meals seemed to induce calmness and obedience, while increasing certain herbal mixtures heightened their suggestibility. These observations, methodical and detached, soon paved the way for far more direct and sinister interventions. Her journal became increasingly disturbing, transforming from observation into confession. Within its neatly written lines were lists of names, dates of departure, and notes on burial sites. According to Elizabeth's records, none of the missing boarders had ever truly left Black Hawk. Their remains, she wrote, were interred beneath the root cellar, in the garden beds, and even within the attic walls. Subsequent excavations verified her claims. Investigators ultimately uncovered 17 bodies across the property, many showing unmistakable signs of systematic bloodletting and surgical experimentation. One particular entry concerning Samuel Thatcher, her first known victim, revealed the crude and experimental nature of her early procedures. Initial subject reacted poorly to extraction, she wrote. Expired before meaningful data could be obtained. Volume removed exceeded capacity of constitution. Margaret worries over disposal, but I have reassured her the soil will accept him easily. Future subjects will receive gradual treatments to refine tolerances. Elizabeth's tone throughout was coldly professional, devoid of empathy or hesitation. She recorded changes in pulse, respiration, and skin tone as though documenting the behavior of laboratory animals. When subjects died too soon, she expressed frustration. When they survived longer than expected, she wrote with satisfaction, noting remarkable endurance or resistance to purification. Nowhere did she display remorse. Nowhere did she refer to her victims as human beings. In her pages, they became subjects or numbered entries, stripped of identity and dignity. Elizabeth clearly regarded herself as a medical innovator, continuing what she saw as her father's unfinished work, though she possessed no formal medical education. She frequently mentioned phlebotomy, moral cleansing, and the removal of corrupted humors as if practicing a sacred science. Her sister, Margaret, emerged in the writings as the pragmatic partner focused on money, appearances, and secrecy. She managed their tenants and finances, leaving Elizabeth free to pursue her grim research. The sisters had chosen their victims with precision. Elizabeth described seeking men susceptible to improvement, drifters, laborers, and loners with no families or social ties, individuals whose disappearances would raise no alarm. In later entries, Elizabeth chronicled her experiments with blood transfusion, convinced that moral purity could be transferred or concentrated through the exchange of blood. She described attempts to infuse cleansed blood from one subject into another, believing she could purge corruption entirely. These procedures, of course, ended in death. Elizabeth attributed each failure not to flawed reasoning, but to inadequate technique, a chilling display of her delusion and detachment from reality. After the fire that destroyed the Wakefield boarding house, Elizabeth Wakefield vanished completely. Despite a statewide search, she was never located. Rumors spread across the Western Territories, whispers of a woman healer, a midwife, or a lodging mistress linked to strange disappearances. The most credible account surfaced in San Francisco in 1880, where a boarding house owner reportedly vanished following a string of tenant deaths under mysterious circumstances. Yet, no definitive connection to Elizabeth was ever proven. Sheriff Buchanan refused to abandon the case. He corresponded tirelessly with lawmen from Colorado to Chicago, pursuing every lead. His final report, filed in October 1872 before his transfer to Denver, reflected his grim conclusion. "I consider Elizabeth Wakefield among the most dangerous individuals I have encountered. Her intelligence, coupled with her distorted sense of moral purpose and complete absence of conscience, makes her capable of endless atrocity. Her victims, men without kin or status, represent those least likely to be protected or remembered. Unless she is captured, I fear her so-called experiments will continue indefinitely." For nearly a century, the Wakefield case faded into obscurity until 1968, when an archaeological team from the University of Colorado made a startling discovery. During what was meant to be a routine excavation of a historic mining site in what had once been Black Hawk, researchers uncovered a sealed metal box buried beneath the foundation stones of the former Wakefield boarding house. Inside lay a second journal, unmistakably written by Elizabeth Wakefield, its entries continuing from the point of her escape. The excavation, led by Dr. Alan Merritt, had initially been intended as a simple architectural survey of early settlement structures, but the find transformed it into a matter of historical and forensic significance. The foundations, still visible beneath decades of debris, concealed a final message from one of the most disturbing figures of Colorado's frontier past: a variety of unorthodox medical experiments within his private practice. Surviving documents from his correspondence suggest a man obsessed with the relationship between sin, illness, and blood. He believed moral corruption manifested physically and could, therefore, be treated through purification of the body. This ideology, equal parts medical theory and religious zeal, would later form the philosophical foundation of his daughter's gruesome work. The archaeological report describes how subsequent construction and demolition at the site had obscured much of the original building, but the Wakefield Foundation remained discernibly larger than other 19th-century domestic structures, implying both ambition and purpose. Early excavation uncovered ordinary household remnants, ceramic shards, broken glass bottles, corroded tools, buttons, pins, and other personal effects typical of the period. Then, on the northern edge of the foundation, workers unearthed something far less ordinary: a metal container, roughly 12 inches long, 8 wide, and 4 deep. It had been sealed with wax, wrapped in oilcloth, and buried beneath what had once been a cornerstone, clear evidence of deliberate concealment. The care taken to preserve it suggested intentional safekeeping, perhaps in the hope that Elizabeth might one day retrieve it. Within the container lay Elizabeth Wakefield's second journal, a document now held under partial restriction in the University of Colorado archives. Those permitted to review it described it as an unbroken continuation of the first, written with the same cold precision, chronicling her flight from Colorado and her continued practice of moral surgery. The journal opens with an entry dated April 10th, 1872, the day of the fire that destroyed the Black Hawk boarding house. In it, Elizabeth describes her decision to abandon her sister and expedite her escape following Sheriff Buchanan's visit. M's hesitation has become intolerable. Her fear of official notice betrays weakness of conviction. The work must not be compromised by worldly interference. I have arranged a resolution that will free both the mission and myself from distraction. Preparations made over recent months will now serve their intended purpose. This chilling passage strongly supports Buchanan's suspicion that Margaret's death was no accident, but rather a calculated sacrifice, part of Elizabeth's plan to erase evidence and sever ties. Subsequent entries outline her eastward journey under the alias Eleanor Phillips, a name supported by falsified papers she had apparently prepared in advance. Traveling by stagecoach, she passed through Denver, Cheyenne, and eventually reached St. Louis, where she remained for several months establishing her new identity. Deprived of her father's original research and her earlier notes, Elizabeth reconstructed her techniques from memory, supplementing them with information from medical libraries in St. Louis. Under the guise of a physician's widow, she gained access to restricted materials on phlebotomy, transfusion, and emerging surgical innovations. By early 1873, she had relocated to a small community outside Springfield, Illinois, purchasing a modest residence and opening it to boarders. Her operations there were notably subdued the journal records, 3 deaths across an 18-month period, a restraint she attributed to her desire to cultivate impeccable respectability before resuming her full program of experimentation. In 1875, suspicion once again forced her to move. Local authorities began inquiring into a missing lodger, prompting her to sell the property and continue westward. The journal documents new establishments in Nebraska, Wyoming, and eventually California, each operating quietly for 1 to 3 years before discovery or risk compelled relocation. Her methods evolved with each move. She became more selective, with victims targeting only those she deemed morally receptive, and more sophisticated in her disposal practices, leaving fewer traces behind. The final entry, dated October 1893, describes her intention to relocate to Chicago, drawn by the anonymity provided by the World's Columbian Exposition. The gathering offers infinite subjects among the transient multitude. A few absences will go unnoticed. I have secured suitable premises on the western outskirts, convenient to both fairgrounds and proper disposal. The influx of doctors for the Congress affords ample opportunity for procurement of materials. Father's work nears its ultimate refinement. The purification advances. After that entry, the journal ends abruptly. Historical records confirm that a boarding house under the name Eleanor Phillips did indeed operate on Chicago's west side during the 1893 exposition. City directories list the establishment as active through 1895, after which all trace disappears. No subsequent documentation identifies the proprietor, and no known death or arrest record matches Elizabeth's assumed identity. The true fate of Elizabeth Wakefield remains one of the unsolved mysteries of early American criminal history, her name surviving only through scattered reports, a handful of chilling journals, and the unearthed bones of men who had simply vanished. The legacy of the Wakefield sisters, however, extends beyond their immediate crimes. In 1968, researchers tracing their lineage discovered that both women were the daughters of Dr. Nathaniel Wakefield, a respected yet eccentric physician in Philadelphia. Following the death of their mother during childbirth, the sisters were raised in isolation under their father's care. Testimony from former patients and fragmented letters hinted that Dr. Wakefield's private studies included experimental procedures intended to purify the blood of moral decay. Though dismissed by his peers as fringe pseudoscience, those ideas clearly took root in the minds of his daughters, blooming, decades later, into one of the most macabre legacies of the American frontier.